Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Mona and Alan. We are post-evangelical ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture. This week, we are going to be talking about fear. I think this is probably a very timely topic to be talking about, considering that seems to be the atmosphere today after the election and the things that we've talked about before, and it being more than just disappointment in a candidate losing, but there seems to be with certain, especially with certain people groups, a legitimate fearful for a lot of different reasons. Our lives, our physical safety, just the direction of the country in general. And we just figured it would be great to have a conversation to hopefully bring some perspective on fear and what it is and how we can deal through it and how we can work through it and how we can turn it into something hopeful, something in that we're all striving for. Love, peace, life.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really sit with this fear and not jump ahead to the peace, because I agree, Jeff, hopefully that's the goal. But I think that even if you disagree politically with what's happening right now, even if the person you wanted to win won, peace can't be cheap, Like we have to, in my opinion, deal with the incredible rift that has formed in our country. I can speak for myself, and I can speak for friends of mine who've spoken to me and with me about these things. Personally, I'm afraid that my rights as a woman are going to be overturned. Rights that protect me from being discriminated against from an administration who doesn't seem to think misogyny is a big deal. And reversing the work of decades of women and activists and male allies who have worked to ensure that I can live in a society and move around without fear of repercussion for being female, and where I have rights to birth control and things like that. I have a lot of friends who are minorities who are, as much as fear as I feel right now, who have voiced intense and incredible terror and devastation in the wake of this election. People who are afraid of their loved ones being deported. People who are afraid of those in the administration who have really extreme anti-gay views, that they will be discriminated against and not protected. People are afraid of increased policing methods, like Black communities and Latino communities, and who are way higher at risk for being incarcerated and experiencing police brutality. So I hear from my friends, like one of my gay friends recently said, that feeling in the pit of your stomach that a lot of you feel, that feeling of nausea and not being safe and not knowing what's going to happen. That's the feeling that a lot of us minorities live with every single day. Welcome to the club. I was shocked by that.
That's the Dave Chappelle SNL comedy sketch. I don't know if you saw that. On election night, although all the white friends he has are freaking out that this is actually happening. And he's like, you're only realizing this now, that this is the world we live in. And for a lot of us, it's a wake-up call to realize that there are people who have lived with fear and lived with discrimination. And we've been able to tell ourselves that that's not America. That's not us, And this has pushed it to the forefront of our consciousness.
And then the wave of hate crimes that have been happening as a result of extremist parties trying to push intimidation. Like, there are white supremacist leaders that are actively encouraging their followers to use fear as a tactic. It's similar to the ideals behind terrorism. So these folks are not advocating violence. I want to be very clear. They're not advocating actual violence, but they are advocating to make minority groups uncomfortable so that they will leave and know that they're not wanted. This is really, I wrote about this in the recent blog post when I wrote open letter to evangelicals. It's really interesting to me that these leaders are actually asking people to use fear as a method of control and intimidation, to quote unquote get our country back, whatever that means. So I want to put a pin in
that. We need to talk about that more. We need to talk about the role of fear and control, because when I look at the last year, when I hear a topic about fear, I think of the way that it impacts us both on the left and on the right and everywhere in between. I think that fear is helpful up to a point. I mean, basically, like it helps us survive and things like that. But fear is sometimes a bad motivator. It's something that provides the people who know how to manipulate it with control to control entire groups. I do believe that Donald Trump ran on a campaign of fear. I think that he used fear about terrorism, about illegal immigration, about all these different things to get elected. And so fear has played a role in all of this, not just now that Donald Trump's elected, people are afraid, but also people that were spoken to that heard Donald Trump and they themselves felt afraid. They were afraid of all of these forces, these criminals that are in their lives, or these terrorists that are outside in their neighborhoods. Like, fear has allowed us to think of demagoguery as being normal, And so like that's a powerful force that's been operative.
And I think it's important to distinguish that fear has not been created. It's been, injected. It's been heightened, because the primary way in which this happens is it's capitalizing on fears that are already existing through primarily misinformation. Like we just had an article recently that Google is, not allowing fake news sites to partake in their ad platform or whatever. And a lot of people calling for Facebook to do the same thing, because a lot of that fear is heightened and pushed forward by the purposeful spread of misinformation to capitalize on fears that are already there in a lot of people.
And I don't want to come across as being callous to the fears that people have because of the result of the election. I have people I know and love that have been targeted for hate crimes because of this. And I know that the fear is very real and that it's not unfounded. I just think that to talk about fear is really interesting right now because it works in so many different ways and it affects us as people in different ways. It might be a motivator to get out and do change, to protect one another, but sometimes it's a motivator for, the unfortunate sides of ourselves, and it can be debilitating both personally and in society.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that it should be a motivator to extend grace if we are not feeling that same fear. I'd like to think that, but so far the reactions that I've seen aren't necessarily the case. But, you have people talking about, well, why is everyone complaining about the election? Their person lost. Like, this is different. This is different. And even if you didn't have the facts that things are different, the response is different. And that should give us all pause, regardless of our views, to reevaluate and to look. But the part of the fear is that when any of us react to fear, we're only contributing to the fear of the other side. And it seems to be an endless cycle. And that's the most discouraging and disheartening part about the whole thing.
Is reacting to fear even a choice, though? There's something really primal about reacting to fear as fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
I think it isn't. I mean, I think it is and it isn't. Like, we can do things to help calm that, like taking the time to step aside or whatever. But I think it's more on the responsibility of people who aren't feeling that intense of a fear to steer the ship while people experience that and work through the intensity of that fear. Because I think it depends.
Steer the ship, you mean like listen to them?
Well, like listen to them, create space for them, and then also work hard to build bridges in the meantime. Because when you're in that fear mode, you're going to be burning more bridges than building, and that's kind of understandable.
It's a hard conversation because sometimes fear serves a good purpose, and a lot of times it doesn't. So it's not like a clean fear is always bad or fear is always good. I'm just interested in seeing how it's applied to control people, because that's, like you're saying, the KKK has been talking about using fear to manipulate people. I've seen fear used politically to manipulate people on both sides. Fear mongering.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Right.
I posted on election day, I'm voting, and I'm going to vote for the people, the candidates, and the propositions that I truly believe in. I will not allow fear mongering to control. And maybe that's because I'm privileged to be able to do that. But I'm tired of the elevation of demagoguery on both sides in our nation. Like, we allow people to tap into those roots of fear to make our decisions for us. And I had that before. I had that in my church growing up, and I don't want to experience that. I don't want to make all my decisions based on that in my life.
I understand that. It seems though that because we've opted into cycles of sensationalism where people really only act when they are completely and utterly outraged, and will only fight for each other when they're completely mortified. That's problematic to begin with, right? Because it allows it allows me to say in this election, well, I'm white, so I don't have to really care or do much about racism or like try to stand against it. Like it doesn't affect me. It honestly, like I don't feel the fear. I'm not saying this is what you guys are saying, but I've heard people saying things like this. I don't feel the fear, so it's not my problem, and someone else will deal with it. It allows for, to me, the most heinous kind of sin against your neighbor, which is neglect. It's one thing to actively attack your neighbor. It's one thing to actively defend your neighbor, but to just not care that that person is being attacked and to do nothing. I don't understand that mentality at all. And I don't understand how a lot of it seems to be coming from the Christian world right now. Like just silence, like radio silence, as far as I can see. But I might be in a media bubble. I might not be seeing it. I don't know. But a lot of people are comparing this election to Kristallnacht. It was the very beginning of Nazi Germany, and it was carried out by paramilitary forces and German citizens. So it was a night when throughout Germany, all these kind of militias and citizens decided to show Jews that they weren't wanted and started breaking all the glass and in
their storefronts and stuff,
vandalizing properties in synagogues. And so it was known as the crystal night, the night of the broken glass, when everybody woke up the next day and there's just shattered glass all over the entire country. And the thing was that the authorities did nothing to quell that or to stop those riots from happening. And it was the beginning. That was before anybody was put in a concentration camp, to people's knowledge. It was the beginning of much worse things to come. And so the people who are afraid right now in this election, if you have a trouble understanding it, if you happen to be in a bubble or you happen to have a skin or a visage that is kind of protected in this election because you're white, like the people who are really afraid, like just if you have a hard time understanding them, understand that they feel like this election was Kristallnacht for them. It's what it feels like. It feels like an overturning of their utter sense of safety. And I include myself in that group.
Because there are places of vandalism, there are stores and there are, priests, LGBTQ priests getting letters and like stuff written. There was a swastika etched, I think it was in California just last night on the doors of a Methodist church. And like there were militias. There were people with guns standing outside of the polling places, like patrolling it back and forth just as civilians. So I can see how there's echoes of that, and people would tie it to that. And the thing is, like, it's not everybody in Germany was full on board with the Nazi program, right? But the moment that something happens in our nation where we see all of this hate rise to the surface, not that if you voted for Donald Trump, you deal in fear and that's what you want everyone to be afraid or something. But the moment you allow the people who want to capitalize on fear to have public space without seriously shutting that down is a moment that it normalizes that, and that becomes more of a problem.
I agree. Like, you should stand up. But the whole shutting it down thing has become really problematic for me because I know that...
Vandalism?
No.
I'm thinking of shutting down vandalism.
Oh, vandalism.
And, like,
okay. Gotcha.
And bullying in schools and like people shouting at students or handing out false deportation notices to people who look different.
Good Lord.
Yeah, so you can say, hey, that's free speech.
This
This student should be able to allowed to make everybody feel unsafe who doesn't look like him. But maybe not with laws, but maybe with like social reaction like that. You can't make that okay, because the way fear works is novelty. We're scared of that, but the more we see something over and over, the less afraid or the less reactive we get to it, and it becomes normalized. And so like the speeches of Donald Trump, half of what he said, if it was said in isolation years before, he never would have been elected. But he said it often enough and long enough that people started to just internalize it and accept it as normal.
But the difficult thing is the other end of it, is that you can't normalize it and you need to react, but then you need to be purposeful with how you react to it, because you could intensify it. So it's a fine balance. It's why terrorism works, right? Like, you create fear in everyone and get them to respond, and you're picking a fight. You're picking a fight. So how do we, and this is where I think that, we can learn a lot from, I'm going to take your role, Alan, but we can learn a lot from Jesus's Sermon on the Mount. This idea of
That's all of our role, Jeff. Just
of being creative and but also aggressive in the way that we handle these things. And I have no solutions, because honestly, I'm one of those people that I don't feel a large amount of fear as much as I do empathy and sadness for people that are feeling legitimate fear for their lives or their safety or the future of their place in this country. And in that place, I feel like I have almost a luxury to be level-headed, and I feel guilty about that.
I mean, it's just a product of your circumstances to feel like you can be level-headed, and you didn't do anything to ask for that, right?
No, but I also feel like I have a responsibility in that to give space
Absolutely.
for people until they're able to be at a place where they can be level-headed as well. And I don't know necessarily how to do that. Like, my instinct sometimes too is to jump on Facebook and enter into the conversations, but I know that that's not going to do anything. I know, if anything, it's just going to put rifts in between myself and those people. So I think it's a long game, right? Like, there are relationships that I have purposely kept in my conservative circles that I meet with on a regular basis because they're good people, and I can have those conversations in places where those are the moments where I believe that a difference can be made, because it's establishing something long-term and real and genuine that's not going to create a divide, but bridge the gap even further.
And some people will say that you can't bridge the gap with hate. Like, you can't. There should be no reasoning with just pure hatred, pure
Absolutely.
unadulterated hatred.
Right? It's just like healthy relationship boundaries. We get to a place with people where we know, okay, I'm spinning my wheels here and I'm making it unhealthy for myself. So I need to either come up with a new avenue or move forward. And I think that a lot of what we've done is we've used the same tactics as the other side. I mean, our
Wait, who's we and who's the other side?
I was laughing. I was like, because I'm not on the same side as.
Let's just use just the basic dynamic of right and left. So the leftist, like the leftist comedy, it can be right on and spot on, but it creates more of a reaction and widens the gap of understanding than really narrows it. Like, it's smart and we love it, but really, does it do anything to make a difference other than confirm what we already believe? Like, is it just another form of confirmation bias?
Yeah, Bodo, you wrote about the echo chamber effect and how demonizing each side allows us to not really deal with them. It's easy to see every Trump supporter as being hateful or inspiring fear, but that's not the case.
In the last 8 years through the Obama administration, a lot of the leftists and Democrats and people who sympathize with Obama looked on it in horror, as when Obama got elected both times, there were effigies of him burned and people holding signs that say "Not my president," and brutal outright racism, calling Obama racial slurs and things like that. And the left looked and reviled people for their reactions, and have, especially in the academy, this is a huge criticism that's come out of the result of this election, that I don't hear a lot of people from the left grappling with. That yes, the left has been intent on destroying injustice and symbols of injustice and rhetoric of injustice in the academy in particular. Let's use an example, but in the process, has not protected the rights of free speech of conservatives, and have perpetuated fear and demonization of conservatives. And conservatives have offered, with their voting power and their messages to liberals and to the world, in so many ways that they are tired of such intimidation tactics. I mean, if you want to talk about tactics of control and fear, a lot of the ways people attempt to enforce political correctness are just that, in my opinion. I mean, I've had people yell at me, check your privilege, in a normal conversation. So there are intimidation tactics being used on both sides. And I think it's really important, before you point the finger and say, stop intimidating me, stop humiliating me, stop shaming me, stop threatening me, you have to look at how your team, whoever that is, has maybe done that. I mean, and I'm totally sympathetic to creating safe space, but there's no but in that. I'm totally sympathetic to creating safe space. I'm totally sympathetic to that. I think we should create safe spaces. But when every place in society is supposed to be a safe space, and there's nowhere for people to be able to ask honest questions and are just being demonized. I think that there is something to be said of the progressive media and progressive people contributing to the present tension that we have, and making people so angry and feel so shut down that they felt like they need a backlash. It's not all of it. That doesn't explain all of it, but I think
you've gotten some blowback for saying that, right?
I've gotten a huge blowback for saying that. Yeah. Huge blowback for saying that. Saying, don't tell me how to protest. I'm lamenting. And I'm saying things like, well, isn't it a form of privilege? They're saying you're privileged to even say, like, there is a right and a wrong way to protest. And I'm saying in response, isn't it privilege to think that your rhetoric doesn't have consequences just because you're lamenting and you think there should be no rules or no boundaries to anything you say? I'm frustrated with that. Like,
right.
And I think it distracts from the real issues at stake. Like you saying, like, I should be able to say F Trump whenever I want to and hold up a sign that says F Trump whenever I want to. You
or
can't
burn
tell me
his
not
head
to.
on a stake like they were doing in the street.
Or whatever people are doing,
right.
Or being the fact that you're so busy defending your right to talk like that in public without thinking about the consequences means that you're missing the point. What I'm trying to say is that kind of rhetoric is distracting to the real point of actually protecting minority rights. Now is not the time for you to defend your right to drop the F-bomb in public. I don't know. This might be a huge tangent, but I feel like I'm talking around something. But all to say, I think the left has been responsible for control and fear tactics too. And I think it's time for us to look at our own complicity in how sensational things have gotten. I'm responsible. I've said things on this very show that make me responsible for that kind of atmosphere. And I'm sorry for that.
And I think it's also with that is this is probably one of my mottos of life, but to embrace nuance, like it's a little cliched, but everything starts with us, right? Like, how do we interact with someone? So if we're at a party and we're having a good time and someone gets offended by something that's said and they just lash out, totally incongruent with whatever insulted them in the first place, a socially conscious person would realize there's something that doesn't match up. So either number one, the insult may have seemed slight to me, but it was definitely not slight to them, or there's something else deeper, more important going on below the surface. And since I'm at a place where I can even recognize that, I need to approach handling the situation in a different way than I would. I'm just going to react to that reaction because it offended me and it threw me off guard. And I think that we're seeing that in our society today, is that for a lot of people, they look at the landscape and they're like, it's just an election. You just lost. Get over it. But they're not being...
Or God is on his throne.
Exactly. They're not being thoughtful enough to stop and be like, wait a minute. This doesn't feel the same way that it usually feels when someone loses an election. Right. Perhaps there's something else going on. And these are idealistic solutions. These are idealistic, like, this is how it should be and the way it goes. But I think it goes back to what space that we're in and giving that, because you're right. Like, in response to fear, we're creating more of it. And I think that there's practical things that we can do that would ease that tide, perhaps. And going back to what I was talking about earlier, I think the spread of misinformation and how it seems like the opposite, where instead of our reactions being fueled by information, our reactions are fueling fake information to heighten that with other people. And I think that that's part of it too. Like before, if I was going to lament or if I was going to grieve, it was within people that I was safe to lament and grieve with. But now we have platforms where we can take that grieving out into people who don't know us, who don't know the context of why we're grieving. We don't open up our funerals to the public. We're with family, so we can act how we want to and what we want to and say what we want to in those situations. And I think that we just have a fundamental disconnect when it comes to public grieving, because it is so public. It is so open to everyone, and there's no way that we can communicate the nuance of who we are as a person in the midst of our grief. All someone is going to see is the face of it.
Well, so I agree with you. I agree with you that there should be a distinction between public and private grief. I think that's also problematic, though, when people feel like a situation like the Trump election is so untenable that they want people to see the extent to which they are distraught and afraid.
Yes.
First of all. Second of all, yeah, I agree that a lot of the fear that's happening right now, some of it is from misinformation. You're right. There's a lot of it that's not from misinformation. And what do you do when you're talking to an opponent and you're like, okay, like you were saying it earlier, Jeff, which is my first instinct, like, what is this really about? What are you really mad about? You know, is it economics? Is it abortion? Like, what is the real reason you are saying the things you're saying? And what if at the end of the day, people are like, no, I'm actually really mad. The core of my anger and speech is that I'm really mad that I'm white and I don't want to share power with people of color. Like, that's why I'm really mad. The real reason I'm really mad is because I'm male and I don't want to share power with females. I think that male should be in charge. Like, what do you, at the end of the day, what do you say to people like who, I guess I'll say, like, if that's just your personally held belief and you're not acting out and expressing that in vengeful or malicious or violent ways, we live in a country where people are allowed to believe that kind of stuff, and you can't say boo about it as long as they're not hurting anybody. You can't say anything about that. Like, you just can't. Like, that is when we embrace a diverse constitution and freedom of religion and freedom of political conviction and personal conviction, that you have to accept those folks at the table too, provided they're not hurting anybody, right? To the same extent that you have to accept an extreme leftist who is who's got really extreme views. If they start attacking conservatives and shaming them, that's not okay either, right? So we've lost sight of this somehow, I think.
We absolutely have. And honestly, the stuff that I'm throwing forward is coming from a pure like textbook standpoint. Like, I'm hypothetically encountering what I would do in that situation, because for the people that are reacting the most to this election, I have never even come close in my life to feeling and experiencing the things that they do on a regular basis. There's a certain level where I just can't speak to that. The only thing I can speak to is people with my experience. Like, I can only speak to my tribe with authority. And if someone from outside of my tribe or my context or my experience then comes to me with questions, I'll be willing to and to be open with those whatever answers, and then also hopefully be able to ask the same questions and gain understanding slowly. But to a certain extent, my hands are tied because I'm not part of that tribe.
Yeah, but you can certainly relay messages and you can certainly speak to people. I mean, if that were completely true, I think like white people wouldn't be talking about racism, right? Like, they might be sympathetic to it, but like, I can't talk about it because I'm not black. Like,
I can talk about it, but I can't. Yeah. I don't feel like I could talk about it to someone who is black and say, you know what I think about racism. Like, I feel like I have to wait for that invitation before I can do it. Not that I wouldn't, but I don't feel like I need an invitation to talk to someone who is white and who is in my family or closely connected to me and being like, look, how do you ignore this issue, and really get to the heart of it from there, and then hopefully be able to make inways there, because that's my tribe and I have that authority or that privilege or whatever.
It's interesting you say that, though, because that you don't feel like you have the right to approach a black person and talk to them about racism. Like, white people have been the primary movers of racism. Like, that's our thing. Like, that's white people thing. I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but it is.
But in the sense of not about the racism, I guess, as a general issue, but in the sense of like trying to inquire or call someone who's experienced racism to a higher way of approaching it, because I've never even I don't feel like that could ever be my place unless I was in a place where I experienced that on some level.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I guess, yeah. You know, as you're talking though, and this might not be what you're saying at all, but I'm thinking of the whole safety pin thing and why I personally don't buy into it. Because while it's a nice idea, I think it kind of has this attitude of like, well, I'm going to designate myself as a safe person, so if you want to come to me and ask questions, then you can. I don't know that if you were saying something like that, but I think it kind of removes the responsibility to go out and make connections and befriend people and to do the work.
I saw that differently with the safety pin thing. Just to jump in there specifically, I see that as a reminder for the people that wear it, that's what they're called to, is to create. And the people who originally wore it, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it started in Australia with transportation. People on public transportation were worried, like, hate crimes are being were going to be done to them, and so they were purposefully going out of their way to sit by people who were different and like communicate that they were an ally or whatever. But I think it's more of a reminder also to the people who wear it, and like obviously it could just be tokenism and just be like lessening your grief for not being a part of real change. But people are allowed, I think, to respond the way that and you would say that people are allowed to respond the way that they want to.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is we're all right? Like there's so many different ways to approach that because there's so many different people to approach. Like that's, even though I believe that there's certain things that I don't think I'd have the audacity or even right to go up to someone and ask them about specific issues, but that doesn't mean I don't have the ability and the right to go up to them and engage them on any other different level. It's just like any other relationship that we have. If you want to maintain a long-lasting relationship, no one starts with, oh, so, tell me the worst thing that's ever happened in your life. And then, or I just don't go up to random strangers and say, here's my whole, I know.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry. That shouldn't, but I can still engage with someone, but then I have to feel my way into that relationship to feel like, well, where's the space where I can then move into that? And I think I think it just gets muddied when we have such an open forum to throw things out there, even though we don't know the people that we're throwing it out to. I think the way that we conduct ourselves online, it wouldn't be the way that we would conduct ourselves in real life.
I was listening to both of you talk, and I think what I'm hearing in general in this whole conversation is, on the one hand, you don't want to dismiss anyone's fear out of hand. And on the other, it's uncomfortable seeing when people use fear to manipulate whole groups of people at the same time.
It's tragic. It's not just uncomfortable. I think we can all agree with that. It's tragic. It's exceptionally tragic when it's based on misinformation. And I would agree that the whole idea that there's some sort of scarcity or natural inherent competition between races to begin with is the first and foremost misinformation of racism.
I've wanted to say that this whole time. This is all about the economics of scarcity. Like, we're scared of the people who are immigrating. We're scared of this. We're scared of that because there's only a little bit to go around and we have to put a fist around ours and protect it from everybody else. That's the economics of scarcity in society, whether that's power or regular economic resources.
We have tremendous examples in history to look back to about this. I mean, okay, yes, maybe what's happening currently in American political society is not completely akin to the rise of Hitler, okay? That's a really strong accusation, and I won't just lob that around easily. However, what started happening in Nazi Germany is ideas spreading around that the reason Germany was in the state that it was all because of Jews. Like, it was actually literally pinned on a group of people for kind of no reason. Maybe other than that, they were involved in financial institutions, and the demonization started creeping in. And demonization meaning you considering someone a demon and flattening their personhood and their humanity. And I see this happening on the right and the left right now, like intense demonization. And I think maybe one of the first ways to stand up to fear is to refuse to participate in demonization to begin with. Like, whether you think it's justified or not to demonize somebody who voted for the person you didn't like, maybe just don't do that. Don't contribute to that cycle. It's not helpful. It actually ends up causing so much resentment. I interpret a lot of the hate speech that's happening right now from extreme, like, white supremacists and whatnot. Like, yes, it's hate speech against groups of people, but it's also resentment for being silenced. It's also resentment for being shamed and for being told that there's certain things you can't say or believe or feel or think, and that your personhood is somehow inherently wrong because you're white. You're not allowed to be proud of yourself in any capacity. Like, there is a self-flagellating kind of activism that does expect, and this is a lot from white people trying to be activists and trying to grapple with race, does expect white people to whip themselves and grovel and grind themselves into the dust. And there's been a reaction against that. So,
which is the ballot box and poll difference. In public pollings, Clinton won, but in private, people went and showed what they really felt. right? They didn't feel safe in public. They didn't feel safe in public to be able to say what they really do feel politically or what they're going to do politically. They waited till the privacy of the ballot box to do that. That's why the polls were all off.
And for some extremists right now, they said, oh, you're going to call me a horrible racist bigot? I will show you what a racist bigot looks like. This is that's my interpretation of some of what's happening.
That's the Pygmalion effect. People become what you constantly say that they are.
I don't know.
If
but
we demonize other groups, sorry, go ahead.
What I am saying too, though, is that can become a kind of victim blaming, and I want to be extremely careful about that.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think it's just, I think we just kind of have to get to a point where we're like, all right, the rest of it seems like, I don't want to say hopeless, but sometimes it does. And also, so large of an issue. We just have to start with ourselves. So what can we do to tide the fear in our own lives to prevent us from lashing out and adding to the pile?
I think it starts with showing actual solidarity and friendship to people who are in afraid, marginalized communities right now. Don't just give them a like on Facebook. Like, call, text, show up, go to rallies. Like, be a community organizer, be an activist. Like, do stuff that makes a difference. Don't just hit a like button and feel better about yourself. Like, if there's a Muslim registry that it gets implemented, hopefully to God, it will not. But if it does, like, go disrupt that system and register yourself as a Muslim. I don't know. Like, there are so many ways to show solidarity and to stand up against discrimination, if that is indeed what is happening and going to happen. Let's hope and pray that it doesn't. But if it does, be ready to stand up and be ready to show actual solidarity and support with people who are in vulnerable positions right now. Please.
And because that's the dual thing, the other side of this is, don't assume that you're not controlled by fear, that someone is not using fear to control your actions and your sense of personhood. Like, in your own life, dismantle the things that control you by fear. And whether that's religious, thinking of this because of me religiously, I had the most personal growth in my spirituality, in my life, when I let go of fear that I'm going to get it wrong, fear that I'm going to get God wrong, that I'm going to go to hell, that all these things. Once that was let go, and I don't want to change the subject and go in that direction. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future. I want to talk about that in the future, but don't assume about how fear has played a role in my religious upbringing and how letting that go, like, I found so much life and freedom and so much more embrace of God and Christianity, leaving fear behind. But that's like a whole conversation that needs to happen in the future, how fear works in religious circles. All that to say, I think that all of us should examine how fear works in our lives, whether we're on the left or the right or somewhere in between or not at all. We have to examine how fear is operating in our world right now and in us before we can tell other people not to be afraid or even standing in solidarity with other people. The work does start with us.
I don't think you can tell people not to be afraid. What you can do, though, is
people are doing that, and it's wrong. They're just dismissing fear out of hand.
Dismissing fear that's cruel. That's just downright cruel.
And what needs to happen is understanding. We need to understand why we're afraid before anything else.
If you think fear is unfounded, go check your sources and offer a humble alternative to or perspective on reality. Like, hey, I noticed you getting worked up because you think all Muslims are going to get deported. Actually, that's not really based on anything anyone said. So here, let's take a look at some sources together. Check your facts, but don't just tell people not to be afraid.
And on the other side, I hear you're afraid that all the people coming into this country as refugees are going to start doing terrorist attacks. Let's take a look at that and actually look at the fact that doesn't happen.
Right. And I think it's hard. I've been critiqued by scholars of color to say that even pointing to facts this or facts that is kind of like a very like white hegemonic way of like, well, if you just have facts to disprove, then we don't have to feel afraid anymore. Just realize that the lived experience of many people in this country. It doesn't matter if there's facts to back up the fear or not. Like, they feel like people aren't dumb. They know when they're not welcome. They know when they're not wanted. They know when there's intimidation and microaggressions happening. People are very attuned to what what certain things mean, certain signals from society. So you don't even have to have a fact if you're probably a minority in this country and feeling this negative energy your direction or this fear. Like, you don't have to have facts to back up that you're feeling that. You're just feeling it. You're just feeling tense. You're just feeling afraid. And that just is. It's not something that anyone should try to talk someone out of.
And I would say along those lines, more than just like the facts of the reality versus the person's fear, but take the time and ask questions about why they're fearful of that. Like, if they're fearful of that because they've received information, then I think information is a good way to go. But if they're fearful of that because they have a legitimate experience where they experience what the rhetoric says is going to happen to everyone, I think it's important to stop and be like, hey, why do you feel that way? Is there a specific instance in your life where you had a negative interaction with this person or that group of people? And start there, because I think that we'd find that there's a lot of experiences that people haven't talked about that they experience that is heightening that fear for them because they have something real and tangible to associate it with. And I think unless we connect through the stories of our lives, through our experiences, we're also not going to get very far if we're just throwing out information and not providing some kind of connection with the people on both the right and the left, or whatever side. I don't even like to use that word, but wherever we're at, and in comparison to where someone else is at. And I think that's obviously harder to do with different circumstances than others. But I think, at least for us, the three of us with our inner circles, where it seems to be so polarized, there's a way for us to go into DM and direct messages or whatever and say, look, you responded this way. Do you have a specific experience? And start there.
This conversation has left me more confused than even when I started. I think I appreciate Jeff saying, calling for nuance, because when I think of fear, I get upset when it's controlling people, when it's used to control people, and I get upset when it's dismissed at the individual level. So I think nuance is definitely something that I have to sit with. Like, how am I going to respond to fear? When is it appropriate? When isn't it? And I don't think it's ever appropriate to say someone else's fear is not appropriate. But understanding it is probably where I'm at. Understanding fear, regardless of where it comes from, and then dealing with it in a nuanced way.
And I would say this is deep existential fear that people are experiencing. And I think that's like a very old brain. That's a reptilian brain response. That's an irrational brain response. I'm not saying that people who are afraid right now are irrational. I'm saying that kicks in parts of your limbic response brain that you almost can't control. Like the sinking feeling that I've had in the pit of my stomach since the election, the feeling of nausea, like I'm going to vomit at any moment, that is out of my control. That's something that I just have to sit with right now. There is nothing sweeter when I'm feeling that way than to just someone come alongside me and be my friend. And just be my friend. Like you have no idea how far friendship and expressions of love go right now in such a tense time for so many people. I mean, evidence alone by the fact that support hotlines for a lot of minority groups like LGBTQ people are like astronomically high levels of calls. Like the amount of intense personal anguish that people are going through, maybe because, like you said, Alan, they've been triggered, or Jeff, that they've been triggered because they've been through something that's bringing up a lot of stuff for them right now that they're having to rework through. I know people personally who are going through that. Or
as in
because
women who have been assaulted, and then now someone who's accused of assaulting women is now president of the United States, right?
You have no idea how terrified some of my friends are who are rape survivors, and are terrified that someone who looks a lot like their attacker or their assaulter is now in the highest office in this country. That is an obscenely terrifying prospect for people. So be as compassionate as you can. In this time, is the only advice I can give, and really seriously consider ways that you can speak out, especially white cis straight people, white cisgendered. So if you're like if you identify with the gender you're born, and you're a straight white person, you have a tremendous opportunity right now to speak to white people who are doing bad and harassing things and saying bad and harassing things, because minorities are terrified and will not speak out for themselves right now because many minorities are too afraid to say anything and to combat this kind of hate because they're afraid that it will come back on their heads 100-fold. So there are immense opportunities to get in conversations and discussions. If you have the privilege of being white, straight, and cis, please use that privilege for good for once, not for once, I shouldn't say for once.
Yeah, for once. Feel the responsibility of that, right?
Feel the responsibility of it. Please do something about it. I don't know how my words are failing me at this point.
Well, that's as good of a place to any to basically open up the conversation. Like, we are, 3 post-evangelical white people of relative economic status and privilege in our society, and our perspective is one perspective or 3 perspectives. So we really add your voice to this particular conversation. You can comment at the show notes at irenicast.com/90. You also find links to some of the stuff that we're talking about. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on email. All of our information is also in the show notes at irenicast.com/90. Please give us your feedback, and perhaps if we get enough feedback come through, we can maybe just do a second part to this and hear from people and speak to that. And I think that this, we use the tagline at the end of all of our episodes. Thanks for joining the conversation. And we would really, this can't be the end. This can't be something that we just stop at. This is something that we need to continue to have conversations for. We personally need and love and would love to hear from other perspectives, to give us new perspective on how we're approaching the world. So,
and look forward in the future to a conversation on how fear operates in religious circles, because I'm going to do it by myself if I have to. I got to talk about it. So big.
You don't have to do it by yourself.
I think with that being said, I think that's going to do it for us this week. I don't think that we really, I don't think this conversation lends to us to end with any kind of segment or game or anything like that. Maybe it's just time to let this settle and let this stop and be the conversation, be the episode this week. And we have some lighter subjects coming to us in the future, but everything with the election seems so imminent and so now that it would be
and heavy,
borderline distasteful for us to ignore talking about these issues, even though we don't necessarily have a complete grasp on them ourselves yet. And I think that's an important place to be sometimes, so that we can open up the door for other people.
If I can just add one thing to that, Jeff, if you are, first of all, somebody who is afraid right now and doesn't have anyone to talk to, message us. We'll message you back. We'll talk to you. We'll be there for you. And we'll help you find resources. Second of all, if you are a person who would like to start asking really honest questions about race and sexism, but you are afraid of being shamed, message us. We'll also talk to you in a non-demeaning way. And we'll try to find some resources for you there as well. But we want you to know that we don't want to stand in any kind of cycle of hate or demonization. And so we open the door to anyone who needs to message us.
I think that's well said. Like, we really do. Our hope for the show from the very beginning has to create a space for people, but that relate to our experience, and also provide open avenues of conversation to talk to people. Because I know that many of our listeners are in places where they're still going to evangelical churches and they're still wrestling with these ideas, and they haven't really put them out there for the world, and a place to talk about them is good. And so again, this is not a plea to get more people to talk to the show, but this is just more get involved, and we would love to figure out ways that we can work together in whatever's going on to create more avenues of understanding and compassion.
Amen to that.
That's right. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thank you for joining the conversation.